I did not actually take a course in geography until the first semester of my PhD. That's not that unusual. While geography is a very big discipline internationally, it's a quite small field within the United States. And there are a lot of theories about why that is. One is that the United States tends to be quite inward-looking, and we're not particularly concerned about learning about other areas of the world. It took me a long time to find geography. I grew up in the suburbs of Chicago. I came to Minnesota to study at Carleton College, where I was a history major, and I became very interested in agrarian history, particularly in medieval Europe of all places, but I also had an interest in Africa. And I think that interest in Africa was in part sparked by a study abroad experience I had in France, southern France, and I stayed with a family that had spent a lot of time in Morocco. So towards the end of my undergraduate career, even though my advisor had encouraged me to consider being an academic, at that point I was very burnt out. I couldn't imagine going into the academy. So I joined the U.S. Peace Corps. So 2 weeks after I graduated from Carleton, this was June of 1987, 2 weeks after that, I went off to Mali in West Africa. I must confess I didn't know where Mali was. I had to look at a map. My relatives, my family, thought I was going to Maui or Bali, two very different sorts of places. Mali's a landlocked country, semi-arid, Sahara Desert in the north, semi-forested, tropical in the south. And I was an agricultural volunteer there for 2 years in a very small village of 200 people. I had French from college, but there were no other French speakers there, so I very quickly learned a local language, Bambara. If you're depending on a language for your food and your ability to get around, it's incredible how motivating that can be. I was affiliated with the state agricultural agency, but my counterpart was somewhat far away, so I was more or less on my own. And I absolutely fell in love with agriculture and natural resource management in that part of the world. I became increasingly intrigued by kind of the ingenuity of local people under very difficult circumstances to produce food, to manage their resources sustainably. That was different than the perception of outsiders. The state agricultural agency often berated local people as being ignorant and backward. But I think living with that community, speaking the local language, being fed by them, I really grew to appreciate their perspective. So based on that experience, I had decided that I wanted to make a career in international development. So I went back, I got two very applied master's degrees at the University of Michigan, and I more or less made a 10-year career in international development. I worked for Save the Children UK, which is a British nonprofit. I also worked for the World Bank Environment Program, as well as the U.S. Agency for International Development. And if I think about that experience, I drew two major lessons from it. One is that at the local level, you could be doing incredibly innovative, interesting work. For example, in Mali, Peace Corps was promoting our participatory forest program. We wanted to work with local people, get them to plant tree species that would be useful to them. But at the same time, this is the late 1980s, Mali had a paramilitary forestry service, literally that wore military uniforms, that carried guns around. If people violated rules, or even if they didn't, but they were accused of doing so, they would be imprisoned and thrown in jail. So my point here is that you could have this very innovative approach, but if national laws or the national kind of policy was not consistent with that, this kind of local level progressive approach would always be limited by broader national or even international constraints. So that's one lesson I drew from that experience. Second lesson, and this came more from the time I spent working at higher levels in Washington, D.C., places like the World Bank, the U.S. Agency for International Development. I met a lot of very interesting, well-meaning, well-educated people, but I often encountered two problems. In some instances, you had young professionals who had gone straight through all the way to the PhD. They had a very sound grasp of theory and the way international development should work, but they hadn't spent a lot of time at the local level, a space where that theory might have been challenged by local level realities. Also, you had older folks working for those agencies, also well-intended, but folks who had oftentimes not been in the field for 20 to 30 years. So they were now somewhat removed from that kind of grassroots experience. And the issue was at the time is that these institutions, these agencies were implementing reforms, okay, many of them of the neoliberal economic variety, and imposing them on developing countries. And a lot of this was going on in Africa. And theoretically, they knew how the policy should have worked, but they didn't have the kind of local level experience that would lead them to question that theory. So those were two conundrums that I was wrestling with when I eventually got out of development. And I did so, truth be told, probably for family reasons. My spouse and I wanted to come back to the U.S. and start a family, and development work, while fascinating, was a bit unstable. And I decided that academia was a way that I could stay engaged with those issues, but have a more kind of stable lifestyle. So I was fishing around at a time for a field that would help me address these two conundrums that I had encountered in development. And in particular, when I had been working for Save the Children UK, we were working on hunger issues, food insecurity issues, doing a lot of mapping. I started running into a lot of geographers. Geography is much stronger in the British Academy than in the American one. And I started reading geographers, people like Paul Richards, Michael Watts, Piers Blakey, and I was very impressed by their work. And I thought this is the approach that I need to think about when addressing development issues in Africa. So what I liked about geography was its tradition of field work. It wasn't an armchair science, but it required you to actually get out and collect information and to talk to people. I appreciated its very central human environment tradition. So looking at environmental questions from both the biophysical side as well as from the social side. And thirdly, I really appreciated geographers' emphasis on scale. So understanding processes that operate at different scales and how those might be connected. So, you could look at something happening at the local level, how is someone managing their farm field, for example, but then you would be prompted to think about how is national level policy influencing what that farmer is doing, or how are international trading regimes influencing what they're doing. So that's what brought me to geography. Since I've been working as a professor for the last 12 years now, my research is really focused on three different areas. My early work as a faculty member was really about questioning some dominant assumptions about poor people and how they manage their environmental resources in Africa. And I, for example, looked at farmers in southern Mali, that same place I had been a Peace Corps volunteer. I had a stratified random sample of households stratified by wealth, and the conventional wisdom was that the poorest households would be the least well-equipped to manage their resources, and in fact what I found was the opposite. I also have worked in southern Africa. I've been very interested in land reform there, the process of giving land back to the black population post-apartheid, which also got me off on a weird trajectory studying fair trade practices, fair trade goods produced on some of these land redistribution farms. And then lastly, and most recently, I've been very interested in the global food crisis. Global food prices spiked in 2007, 2008, and incidentally, they're high again in 2011, and how this has impacted households in cities in the global south, and in particular in the African context. So that, Peter, is how I got to where I am today.
I'm interested in this transition from Peace Corps volunteer to the work in international development.
Mm-hmm.
I suppose one thing that motivates a person to work in development is a sense that something needs to be done,
Mm-hmm.
or that there is indeed a lot of need that has to be addressed. But another piece of it often is a sense that one has something to contribute,
Mm-hmm.
that one's experience gives one a particular angle on this. I'm wondering if that was part of what you were taking from your work in Mali
Mm-hmm.
to the development agencies that you were working with, an idea that you had a perspective on this they needed to hear or understand.
Mm-hmm. That's an excellent question. I'll start with the Peace Corps and then talk how that evolved from that point. I did not join the Peace Corps to save the world. I frankly think I was, and I don't know how quite to put this, that I had become disenchanted with life in the United States. Having grown up in the suburbs of Chicago, I was surrounded by a culture of mass consumption and overconsumption, and I think I wanted to get away from that, and I wanted to see the world from a different perspective. I got a glimpse of that when I studied abroad in France as an undergraduate, but I knew that there was even a more different vantage point if I could spend some time in the global south. So I think that's really what led me initially to join the Peace Corps. And then I think what in part led me to continue was that it was intellectually one of the most exciting and challenging opportunities that I had ever had. You know, so many of my assumptions were challenged. And I was just, like I said, fascinated by you know, people's understanding of local ecologies and how to manage those. So, for lack of a better expression of this, I think a large part of it was I got an intellectual buzz out of it. That this is what made life interesting to me. And if I was going to give back or change, you know, yes, I probably did feel like that in collaboration with local people that I had something to offer. But I think almost more importantly, I felt like I had something to offer to the development business. That I was frustrated by a kind of a top-down history, a history of experts kind of identifying problems and solving them with outside expertise, when in fact I saw it as much more of a collaborative process, that local people had insights to offer, and that those could be paired up with insights from people who had had the opportunity to study and had a more kind of universal understanding of certain phenomena, and that together one could you know, discover a better way to do things.
So would it be fair to say that part of what was going on in your move to development was realization that if you stayed in Mali and continued working kind of at the local level, you'd keep running up against barriers from the standpoint of the aid organizations who were misunderstanding important features of what was going on there.
Mm-hmm.
Is that fair?
So to be clear, so I was in Peace Corps. I got 2 very applied master's degrees, and then I actually went back to Mali.
Oh, okay.
Initially, I was working with Save the Children UK, running a large village food security project in a different part of the country, and then I moved with them to southern Africa, working in Harare, Zimbabwe, in Malawi, and Lesotho. I think later, particularly with my geography training, I did definitely come to understand that there were limits to good local work, and that if you were interested in change, you had to work for that change at multiple levels. So you still needed to do good local work, but you needed to be thinking about national policy and international policy. And I think this too opens up, in a sense, a space for academics, because academics work at the level of ideas, but these ideas in the academic world are not divorced from the world of practice. So if you look at the policy of the World Bank, it is influenced by a set of theories, a set of ideas. And I think for those of us in the academy, that's the arena we often work at, the kind of the world of ideas that can in turn influence practice.
So the story of your involvement during the time you were working in development really has at least 2 stages, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's the stage where you come back with 2 applied master's degrees to places where you were working more or less ignorantly as a history major from Carleton who gets dumped there. You come back with a couple of master's degrees in charge of something rather larger than you were ever imagining being in charge of in your earlier time. And there's a serious period of that sort of educated local work in your history that then comes to an end or fades into work at administrative, at higher level administrative or policy.
Correct.
Sort of agencies. Okay. Can we just focus for a second on that first piece? You come back to the place you were as a Peace Corps volunteer, now with an education, now with some authority, now with an institution behind you. What was that like? And what did you learn in that phase of your progress?
Sure. I mean, now that I think back on it, I had an incredible level of responsibility for someone my age. I think I was in my mid to late 20s then. I had 26 staff who were working for me. We had 4 different offices. We had, I think we had 4 Land Rovers, 2 boats, and over 20 motorcycles.
What a set of toys! I mean, just from the toy standpoint, you lucked out.
Yes. Responsibilities that I never would have had in the United States, most likely, for someone that age. And I do remember when I first started working for Save the Children, the attitudes of my staff, and so we had staff who were located at these kind of sub-bases that were working directly with communities. The attitudes of my staff were not all that dissimilar from the agricultural agents that I had interacted with when I was a Peace Corps volunteer. And they were similar in the sense that there was this belief that because they were educated, that they had the answers, and it was really their job to provide those answers to local people. So one thing I worked very hard on early with that organization was to convince my staff to be a bit more humble, to get them to recognize that local people had something to offer, and that it was really needed to be much more of a two-way collaborative process. We engaged in a lot of what we would now call participatory research. So we were working with communities to identify challenges in those communities, to rank them, to prioritize them, to kind of brainstorm with them about the most appropriate solutions to those problems. Just to recap, there was a pretty significant shift in responsibility, but for me at least, it was the prior experience as a Peace Corps volunteer combined with my academic training that really informed the way I went about that job. And I think in part because of that, today I really encourage my students to go out, shortly after they graduate and get grassroots experience, to kind of operate at the lowest level where you are a peer of local people. Because once you get older, I think it's difficult to go back and do that again. And I think that experience can influence in a very positive way your kind of behavior later on in your career as you, in many instances, move up the institutional hierarchy.
So, how successful were you in this hands-on phase of your administrative life in really bringing the knowledge and intelligence of the local people to bear on the problems you are responsible for helping to solve? I'm curious both whether you could break down the implicit academic arrogance of your staff, and whether you could break down the expectation from the local side that wisdom was going to come, that wise men from the West were going to solve the problem.
Again, it's a really good question, and I think the results were probably somewhat mixed. I mean, over time, I think my staff came to understand what was important to me and probably acted in a particular way when I was around. I'm not 100% convinced that that was always happening when I wasn't there. And the particular spatial setup is that I was at one office and we had 3 sub-offices, which often took a day or 2 to get to. So there was it's not like I could drop in unannounced, that these were challenging places to get to. So there was somewhat of a distance between my staff and I. The other point, which is absolutely true, is that local people had come to expect outsiders to come in and to provide the answers and to react in a very submissive way. And in some sense, they were quite cunning about all this. They knew that if they behaved in certain ways that they were likely to get resources, so they were adept at playing that game. So I think, and you hint at this in your question, is that the challenge of getting local people to interact with us in a different way was as or more challenging than to get my own staff to interact with the local people differently. But I know that can happen. I had some very gratifying, circumstances where we studied a particular local phenomena. We documented how people were managing their resources, and came back to them and kind of walked them through the process and showed how, that in fact what they were doing made a lot of sense. It wasn't backward. That we could experiment with certain approaches and improve them in a particular way. And I'd like to think that was very empowering for them. And it was the beginning of a change in the way us and they thought about development.
How were your staff educated? What were they bringing? What the sort of normal staff person in this kind of context, what are they bringing to the experience? And how does that affect how good their ears are?
Sure. So, of those 26 or so people, there were probably 4 with university educations. There were another 4 who were basically drivers or who had little to no formal education, and then the remainder had high school educations, but they were high school educations that were vocational in nature. So many of them had been trained to be foresters or to be agricultural agents at the kind of high school level. So it's a different setup than we're used to in the United States. I think that the challenge in Mali is that so few people, particularly in remote rural areas, possess formal education that it is definitely a status symbol. It's rare enough that you feel like if you have a degree, whether it's a high school degree or a college degree, that you deserve a certain position in life, and so that's very much looked up to. It's difficult for me to say, whether, if I compared the folks with high school educations versus college educations, if one group was kind of quicker to come around and recognize the insights and abilities of local peoples. In some ways, I think that almost depended more on a particular individual's temperament. And then, the group that really had no formal education, they were, less in a position to interact with local people, so I can't really comment on them.
So, after, as you say, a kind of mixed success in taking seriously the strengths and intelligence of the people you were working with, you move to more policy level or administrative level activity within the development agencies. What was that move like, and what were your conflicts and thoughts as you kind of left the field for sort of the next level up?
So after that, running this large village food security project, there were 2 or 3 kind of levels that I evolved through. After that, I did become a food security advisor to the government of Mali, and I was actually within a government ministry. So there I dealt mostly with government civil servants. Then I went to Southern Africa, where I had 3 postings, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Lesotho, and there it was a very large research project. We were collecting baseline data to establish a new food security or hunger monitoring methodology, which was known as the household food economy approach, which eventually was operationalized through a computer model known as RiskMap, which subsequently got picked up by USAID, and that's how we monitor famines in sub-Saharan Africa today. So that was very much of a research position, and it was actually an amazing experience because I got to visit almost every district in those countries to interview people and collect data. And then the other was much more of a policy analyst in Washington, D.C. Here there were two very different experiences. I worked in the World Bank in the Environment Department for a really interesting ecological economist named Herman Daly, who was kind of at the forefront of thinking about sustainability and how do we change mainstream economics to account for that. Very innovative and interesting research. The World Bank has an endless amount of resources in terms of data and an amazing library, so great place to do research. What I came to understand, and what subsequently led to Herman leaving the World Bank, is that the World Bank essentially has an operations arm that does all the lending, that implements development projects, and then it has more of a think tank policy arm, and the two sides of the World Bank are not necessarily very well connected. So while we were doing very interesting work, I think it had very little impact on the actual functioning of the World Bank. And then when I was working for USAID, I was in the evaluation arm. I was basically responsible for reviewing all the data that came in about environmental projects. This was 1997. This is during the Clinton administration. Al Gore had this initiative called Reinventing Government, and the idea was that government would engage in massive data collection, and every year every program or agency would produce a report that kind of analyzed that information and showed progress. Development is very difficult to undertake. I don't think it's very easily quantified, so I question whether that assessment process was all that useful or informative. In many ways it was a giant bean counting exercise. But I think most interesting to me, both at the World Bank and at USAID, were all the kind of conversations that I had with colleagues while I was there, and that's as I hinted at when we first began talking, where I began to get the sense that in many instances, while people were extremely well-meaning, they were somewhat disconnected from the field. The World Bank is a place that's really dominated by economists and economistic thinking, and there isn't always kind of a priority on spending time in the field. And then at USAID, really since the Clinton administration moving forward, USAID has been much less of an agency that implements development programs and more of a donor. So you have fewer and fewer people there that spend time in the field. They basically make grants to other agencies, nonprofit organizations that implement programs. So they're kind of in the business of monitoring those programs. And I think, I do think that's a bit of a problem, because you become kind of removed from the real work that you're trying to promote.
So, if I'm understanding right, a big part of the jobs you had in one phase of your development career involved understanding what was happening on a pretty broad scale. And developing tools or analytic mechanisms for saying what was happening on a pretty broad scale based on pretty massive data collection. Now, I'm curious as to whether when you began doing that, this knowledge of and kind of respect for local practices, local intelligence, the sense of what was going on the ground, did that kind of fade? I mean, was it a new way of thinking that came in when you began this sort of summing things up mathematically kind of work? Or was it still there? I mean, how did... It seems like a very big shift from knowing how it happens village by village and knowing how different the villages are and how they approach this, and maybe knowing how different the particular farmers are and how they approach this, and knowing how different... I mean, one issue, I suppose, is just knowing how different a particular set of resources plays out in as poverty or non-poverty in a particular context. In the same way that in North Minneapolis you can take the same household income and in two households it will mean hugely different things for the quality of life.
Yes, yes.
I mean, you have all of that very fine-grained sense of the ways these numbers can be misleading, the ways these numbers can, you know, overlook the real stuff, and then you become the numbers guy. What does that do to you, and how does that, what kind, did you find yourself feeling like you know, your multiple personality and numbers man had taken over, or how was that for you?
You know, I don't think I really spent enough time at those upper levels to kind of go to the dark side.
Yes, I guess that was my question.
You know, I knew when I was working there that I really missed the field level work. I kind of missed that form of engagement, and I was always kind of looking for a way to get back to that and to kind of get out of DC and go visit these places that I was collecting numbers about. You know, I subsequently got back into academia where that, you know, I could do field work again and go visit these places. So I suppose in a way that's how I dealt with that. In retrospect, I think that work at upper levels was just as important because arguments needed to be made at, you know, at different scales at those levels. But if I think about, you know, what really made me happy and what got me excited, it was the local level work.
Yeah. Now, am I understanding right that the story of development generally is the story of less and less people having coming to the upper levels with field experience? Is that the story you're telling? I mean, with the diminishment of the Peace Corps, with you know. I mean, is there a story such that kind of at the beginning there were a lot of people who knew a lot about what was going on the ground who then moved up kind of the way you did, but there's less of that in the present, or how's that picture?
I'm not quite prepared to go that far. You may or may not be aware that Peace Corps just is celebrating its 50th anniversary in 2011. We don't hear about it in the same way that we did in the 1960s, but it's still a very, vibrant organization. I have a lot of students who do Peace Corps. I think Macalester ranks 6th amongst small colleges for Peace Corps volunteers. But I do think there have been some structural changes in the United States in terms of the way we deliver aid, which means that certainly people, working for government, in the U.S. Agency for International Development in particular, have less opportunity to spend long periods of time in the field than they may have in the past, which means that you need to get that experience either through Peace Corps or working through a nonprofit. I'm not quite sure how to say this, but I also think, and I notice it at Macalester a little bit, we have a lot of students who come here and they have an interest in internationalism, they want to work internationally, and there is this kind of allure or this, romantic appeal of being, an articulate UN official that's brokering world peace. And I think, in order to do that well, you in my view, you need to spend a lot of time in the field coming to terms with the reality so you can have those type of insights. And sometimes some students, I don't think, are quite prepared to pay those dues in order to get to that place.
Well, it's the fact that it's dues, too. I mean, when I went to Macalester, and I mean, the heroes I was hearing about, well, when I came here and then afterwards, 69 to 73, were, the folks with backpacks who went to the villages, who, lived with the people, who learned the language. I mean, that was the romantic stuff. Sitting in an office, delivering edicts was not going to be fun. Whatever the salary. I think that was, and the romance of the Peace Corps was not the romance of being able to sign large checks. It was the romance of getting in there with a shovel and actually digging a hole that led to water that, that was there for a village. I mean, that was what was drawing people to the
Yes, yes.
And when I say, the diminishment of the Peace Corps, I have no idea how big or small the thing is compared to where it was when it began. I just know that the romance isn't there in the way it was. The sense that, AmeriCorps has a bit of the romance the Peace Corps used to have. And I hear kids talking about AmeriCorps with that gleam in their eye. You're going to get thrown into something you probably can't handle, and you'll have to cope. That's the gleam. It's the T.E. Lawrence thing. Yeah. They're going to put you on a camel and say, lead the army, and learn Arabic along the way.
Yeah. Well, let me just respond, and this is perhaps a little bit of a tangent, but I think it's very germane. Macalester, like I said, has a history of, our niche is kind of internationalism. We have a lot of students come here with international interests. And this is a bit of a caricature, but what I notice, particularly in the social sciences, is that first-year students come, they're very excited, they want to make a difference. Yes, they're probably a bit naive. They kind of spend a fair amount of time in the social sciences, and they come to understand that development is really problematic. And they begin to get jaded, they get cynical. Development is a kind of neo-imperialist project. To kind of engage in the name of the United States, working for the United States government and other parts of the world, is so flawed that you know, I'm just going to stay here in the United States and kind of till my garden in my backyard and avoid these kind of messy circumstances overseas. I think, and I think that's a problem, a huge problem, because in some sense, I think we're disempowering our students. And so the argument I've always made with my students is, yes, development is hugely problematic. In the past, we've gone about it in very inappropriate ways. But that doesn't mean we should, you know, throw the baby out with the bathwater. We still have people in other parts of the world that are living in inexcusable circumstances. You know, people are dying, people are hungry, and I think ethically, we shouldn't just let that be, that we should be willing to think about how do we creatively address that. So for me, the challenge is very much about reinventing development, doing it a different way. So that's, I think that's one piece of why some students don't go into Peace Corps. The other piece, which I'm alluding to, and is, you know, I didn't like much about Ronald Reagan, but I gotta hand it to him. I think he was very effective at crushing the younger generation's belief in government. And, you know, I've had countless conversations with my students, and there's this kind of inherent distrust in government. Many students don't really believe that government can do good. I happen to think differently. So I think it's a bit of this kind of concern about development as a neo-imperialist project, but also this lack of faith in the ability of government to do good that you know, causes students to do other things.
And I learned from your colleagues one floor down that there's a comparable movement to take ethnography to be a neo-imperialist movement. You put the two together and everybody's pretty much ignorant of everything except at a level of abstraction so high that all the interesting things get obscured. I guess I'm curious to ask it personally. I mean, I think the teaching aspect is really important, but how satisfactory is the academic life given what you were trying to accomplish by coming here? I mean, if I understand right, you felt yourself too far from the realities you were engaged with in the field. But you didn't go back to the field. I mean, you didn't go back to basic level development. You went to the academy and then you know, to this department. How well did that work at satisfying that impulse to get closer to the facts you cared about?
You know, much better than I could have ever imagined. And to be fair, I think part of the reason I didn't go back to the field did have to do with family circumstances and wanting a more stable life. But you know, I think sometimes we think about this divide between activists and the academy. You know, there are people that just kind of go out and do stuff, and then, you know, and then there's folks in the academy that think about it. You know, if you buy in at all to kind of postmodernism and post-structuralism, I think one thing it tells us is that, you know, even if you're an activist, nobody just does something, okay? They're always acting on some mental model of how the world functions, okay? So whether or not they're cognizant of it, their theory of how the world works is influencing them. So for me as an academic, that world of ideas is really important, and that you know, if you know, through my scholarship, through my teaching, if I can change how we think about different issues, I think that can have an influence on development practice, and that's very important and it's powerful. The other thing I've come to realize, certainly now that, you know, I'm a full professor and I don't have to worry about getting promoted anymore, is that I have so much freedom to write about issues that I care about. So I continue my academic publishing, and I enjoy my, you know, conversations at academic conferences or via the written word in peer-reviewed journals. I enjoy my conversations with my specialist colleagues. But there's another side of me that has become very interested in public scholarship and writing for well-educated general audiences. So I've, you know, written a number of op-eds for newspapers. I've had the, you know, good fortune to be interviewed on the radio and on TV. And what I found is that not only can I add to that kind of public conversation about an issue, but I have the freedom to say things that my colleagues working within the UN, working within government agencies cannot say. And I cannot tell you how many times I've written something and then someone else has written me back and said, you know, I'm so glad you wrote that. You're absolutely right on. I was just, you know, I was not able to write something like that given where I am now. So I think academics and our freedom to express our views is very, very important in terms of having a rich public conversation about certain issues.
This is a matter that comes up again and again in conversations. I was interviewing folks about the BP oil spill, and the issue is what can you say and what can't you say? And quite frequently what academics point to is that, well, when you have arrived as a full professor, there are many consequences that are excluded, but there are also always avenues of pressure. There are ways that you can be marginalized, for example. And so I find full professors, eminent people, talking, for example, about the oil industry or about the large agribusiness concerns and so forth, still feeling that they have to be careful for all sorts of reasons that it takes a while to get out and explain. I'm wondering if you feel in any way that you have to be careful, where the care is not intellectual care, but care for your reputation, care for your income, care for your standing, even in the academic, relatively freedom of a full professorship at a small college.
So I can certainly imagine circumstances where faculty would feel constrained. I remember, you know, shortly after 9/11, certain academics spoke out about it, and I think particularly if you were at a public university, you were in some ways potentially subject to censure from someone in the state legislature because your salary comes at least in part from public coffers. I can also imagine if you're doing research in a realm that is funded by private donors, you know, if if one were an agronomist and, you know, their funding is coming from agrochemical companies, then, you know, you might be hesitant to speak out against, you know, those issues. I don't really feel those pressures. Part of it is being at a small liberal arts college. You know, most of my funding comes from, you know, the National Science Foundation or the Fulbright Hays program of the Department of Education, so these are not private donors. I think really for me it's you know, I have to make sure that, you know, I've done the research, okay, that I've carefully analyzed the information at hand, so public scholarship is not disconnected from more kind of formal peer-reviewed scholarship. You know, the public scholarship flows out of that. And as long as I've made sure that I've been intellectually careful and rigorous, you know, if I think a major point is missing from public discussion on an issue, and I'm well positioned to comment on that, and I have expertise in that area, I feel an obligation to interject my views into the discussion. Of course, it's incumbent upon somebody publishing them, and that's not always easy to do. But you know, as long as I've done the rigorous intellectual work, I don't feel a hesitation to speak out.
How good are the fiber optic cables, metaphorically speaking, between this office and the people you used to work with? That is, the folks who are at various levels in the development and aid operation, the people who might be able to make different decisions based on the work that you do.
I have personal networks of people that I have worked with in those agencies over the years, and we stay in touch. When I'm in the field, I see them, and I share with them what I write. And you know, if they agree with what I've said, oftentimes they'll pass that along to other people they work with. You know, a few years ago, well, I'm good friends. I'll just say this for the record, that I'm good friends with the director of Peace Corps in Mali. A few years ago, another scholar and I wrote a piece which indirectly critiqued the way Peace Corps was going about its training. I shared that with this friend with the Peace Corps, and it subsequently led to a change in the way they do training. So that was a pretty direct cause and effect. It's, you know, in many instances, I share that with them. It circulates within their agencies. It's not particularly clear to me if anything happens, although in many cases people tell me that they're glad that someone took the time to express that view.
So it sounds like publication really is just one way that academic stuff gets into the discussion, and maybe not ultimately the most important way. That it's the circulation among people who know and respect each other that is really doing a bunch of the work by which the relatively independent academy can exercise some kind of critique or independent judgment on things like aid operations. It's fascinating.
But I think by writing it down in a succinct fashion, which you're often required to do with something like a newspaper op-ed, it makes it easy for that to circulate within these agencies, so that if you didn't, you know, if this was just a conversation at a bar, it would be less likely to have a second life.
The Pelican brief has to be the exception and not the rule.
Yes.
Yes. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you.